Good morning, bonjour, monsieur, mesdames. It's a great pleasure to be here in Paris, and as you just alluded to, it's also a very special privilege to have made it, because last night, as we began our takeoff, the plane decided that it wasn't time to take off, and we went back, and then we had to find another flight, and this morning I had this slightly surreal experience of zooming through Europe's spring morning landscape, having just been in the Gaza Strip 15 hours before, and I was wondering, how do you connect what I was doing yesterday with where I am today and addressing you? And having an hour on a train without much sleep over the night, the thoughts wander. And what I would like to begin with is by saying that I do believe there is actually a connection, very much, that is exemplified by what I would call the environmental agenda of the 21st century, between talking about the environmental impact and realities in a situation like the Gaza Strip, or indeed the West Bank and Israel, or indeed the Middle East, and then from there really into any direction in the world. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we have moved, when we talk about environmental issues in the 21st century, from addressing phenomena that we do not understand very well, but began to realize had long-term consequences. And in many ways, the environmental issues of the 20th century were driven by imperfect knowledge, but recognition of something happening that in the end would turn into a problem. It began very often with very local issues. It also began with things that had to do, for instance, with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the realization that something that was beginning to open up opportunities from an economics and production perspective in the 50s and 60s was beginning to turn into a boomerang of far-reaching consequences. And when we talk about the environmental agenda of the 21st century, then I think what we are talking about is essentially about how things are connected. Increasingly, I'm convinced that environment is not an agenda, a sector, or a concern in its own right. It is increasingly becoming a way of thinking, a way of understanding, a way of practicing or doing business, for that matter. And if you look at what is behind that, then we have in fact developed over the last 30, 50 years a significant amount of, one, expertise, particularly the science and the scientific understanding of our environment has allowed us to increasingly realize that we do live in a system. In fact, in many systems that are connected, but also within each system, there are interdependencies. And science, and you can call it ecology, biology, have increasingly allowed us to understand those connections and linkages, and therefore also begin to appreciate the causality of acting in one domain with what it has on another. The notion of ecosystems has become, if you want, one word that is associated with that growing body of knowledge that has opened our eyes to both risks, dangers, but also opportunities. But alongside these scientifically based concepts have also evolved a series of important analytical and policy and managerial concepts. We can talk today, for instance, about something that you will hear about more tonight. The linkage between the ingenuity of nature as a designer of products and processes and its implications for future technologies, products and processes that humanity can either emulate, build on, or benefit from. It is referred to by one of the people who will be with us as biomimicry. Another way of saying it is simply bringing people with all sorts of different understandings together about the ingenuity of nature and allowing these to be connected for the benefit of something that allows us to do things tomorrow that we would only dream of doing and having that being possible today. But we also have other concepts that have accompanied the notion of a planet and an economy, a global economy increasingly faced by resource constraints on the one hand, disruption on the other, such as climate change, collapse of ecosystems, the increasing collapse of the global fisheries in the world's seas. And that has to do with efficiency. The environmental agenda of the 21st century could almost be called something completely different. You don't have to be a green believer in order to implement an environmental agenda. Why would you not favor the development of vehicle engines that can transport you from A to B at 50% of the energy cost that you have to invest? Why would you buy a light bulb that uses 5 times more electricity than one that is on the shelf right next to it that you can use? And the question really is, why did it take us 50 years to get that patent and that technology from the drawer to the supermarket shelves, when in fact we knew how to light up our halls, rooms, streets with 1/5 the amount of power that we actually have to use today? So it is another example of how ideas are beginning to be connected in a different way. I believe that the business schools of tomorrow will teach increasingly notions such as factor 4 and factor 10, concepts such as biomimicry, the concept of a circular economy as it is increasingly being articulated both scientifically and in terms of government policy in China. Looking at the question of how concepts such as the triple R concept that has evolved over the last 30 years in Japan will become guiding principles for our economies and therefore also for our businesses. It is against this backdrop of understanding that the environmental agenda of the 21st century is not one that stands alongside that of economic growth, of jobs, of development, of stability, but it is in fact increasingly becoming a defining parameter of it and increasingly a driver that will determine the kinds of choices that we make as societies, how they are reflected in public policy, and how markets, businesses, entrepreneurs, venture capital funds, and investors will respond to them. Quite clearly, climate change has, in many ways, accelerated a process that was happening across this much broader environmental agenda. If you think that science has become a driver for fundamental transformational decisions affecting our economy, our economic development choices today, science that only 20 years ago was laughed about when the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme initiated the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It met in little side rooms. It was a group of scientists that the rest of the world thought was talking about something maybe in 2200. In less than 20 years, greenhouse gases, and particularly CO2, which probably most of us had last heard about when we left school, has not only become one of the most serious factors that we have to take into account, it is beginning to drive in terms of the policies, the incentives, and also regulatory frameworks that will guide our economy in a way that I think no one had anticipated, and this literally in less than a decade. Who would have thought that we will talk about carbon markets 10 years ago that will probably in 5 to 10 years exceed the value of $100, $200 billion? Probably not.